Now, sorry, there's going to be a mic on my face now for the next 15 minutes or so. Just to let you know, the slide's a little bit misleading. That's the only slide. So there's no pictures. I won't do any kind of little tricks to the side or anything like that. But no, it's great to be here. It's a pleasure on behalf of the Commissioner to be in a room like this with all health researchers and stakeholders in the health research sector. One of the big areas we work on in the Commission is engagement. So we don't sit in a room and come up with interpretations of the law in the blind. We talk to stakeholders, we engage. We invite engagement from stakeholders because we need to learn from the experts in the field as to how data protection is applied. It's great being a lawyer in terms of being able to read the law. Oh, sorry. It's great being a lawyer in terms of being able to read the law, but the skill in being a lawyer is actually applying it. That's the real trick in the game. So today's seminar is a very important staging post in terms of the new health regulations that Murish has gone through in his presentation. It's very important what it means for you in the health sector and what you need to do to ensure those appropriate safeguards are in place. So obviously consent is a big issue, which we'll probably explore for the rest of the morning and early afternoon. As the independent regulator, the DPC also has an important role in raising awareness. So for today, it's really important that we're here to help not only the Department of Health, HRB, but yourselves as the people on the ground that actually have to manage this regulation and these regulations. Before I get into the meat of things, it's worth recalling the reason why we're here today is really because of the impact of GDPR. So the health research regulations are a reaction to GDPR. And it's led to the policy direction being taken by the Department of Health. Through extensive negotiation and engagement, they have formulated this response. And as Murish has said, the Data Protection Commissioner, through myself, have been heavily involved in assisting the Department of Health in that process. But GDPR, as of today, is 21 weeks old. And that's very important for everyone to actually note. This is not something coming down the line. It is live. It is here right now. And the build-up has ended. So when you heard the likes of Y2K, when you heard the likes of data is the new oil, it's all this conference speak. That would mean it's meaningless to yourselves on the ground in terms of what you do as health researchers. We are talking about the now. It's the reality. So it's not about what ifs. We now have to be ready. We now have to be in compliance with the regulation. To give you an example, the first commission in Europe out the door in terms of enforcement was Austria. So the first enforcement in GDPR has happened at a European level, and it came from the Austrian Commission in terms of using CCTV in a public area without the appropriate assessments being carried out. The Austrian Commission, I suppose, in leading the way, their commissioner is the chair of the European Data Protection Board. So it was also sending a message to the rest of Europe that this is real. So just always bear that in mind. So we don't have any more nonsense, no more of the hyperbole, no more of misleading messages, scaremongering. There was an awful lot of scaremongering. We in the Commission have been trying to put a lid on that scaremongering because some of the stuff has gone out of control in terms of what consultants and people on stages like this are saying. And it's just misleading and it creates confusion, which is unhelpful. A best example I can give is actually through my own personal life. My daughter attends a Montessori's, and I went into the Montessori and they actually hand out newsletters on a weekly level indicating to everyone what's going on. And I said, why don't you send an email? And the lady, the manager of the Montessori, said to me, because of GDPR, I can't send an email. And I'm like, obviously she doesn't know who I am. And I didn't explain who I was. So what I said to her was, I think actually it's not GDPR, it's GDPR. And I left it at that. But this is the irrational actions that are happening in terms of the regulation. Because in fairness to the lady and the manager, she is scared senseless. But we are allowed to send emails under GDPR, just to note that, please. But on a more serious note, the main reason I'm here today is to cut through that nonsense, because it is absolute nonsense. It's time for straight talking. It's time to be frank. And these engagements are great, especially with the Q&A. It allows me an opportunity to be more frank about things, give you better direction. Also, we have a new buzz topic really in the legal world, which is all about plain English. We would have heard our Chief Justice talking about plain English in terms of legislation, in terms of drafting. So we are trying to achieve a plain English approach, not only in data protection, but generally in the legal world. Let's hope legislators and drafters get the memo, because that's where a lot of the confusion can also arise in terms of reading legislation. So obviously guidance, taking ownership and control of the legislation and trying to make something that means sense to your sector is what it's all about. But you can't do that without actually putting in the groundwork, without really getting stuck into it. It won't happen overnight. But if you make an attempt, you'll be in a better place than just saying, oh, this is too difficult. Because that's what's happening in reality. That's what we're seeing on the ground. Myself and a colleague here, Laura Flannery, who helps me in a great deal in the health area, we see data protection as an excuse. It can be an excuse to do nothing, or it can be used the other way, that something can't be done. So I read the Irish Times or other newspapers, and every now and then, or more in Ireland, and every now and then I hear, because of data protection reasons. And when I hear that, I know it's rubbish. Because data protection doesn't get in the way. Data protection is there to balance a fundamental right with your own interests. So it's to do it in an appropriate manner. I can't think for the life of me how it stops a lot of things happening. The reason it stops a lot of things happening, in my view, is because the individuals on the ground, the controllers of data, are simply not carrying out the assessments required. They are simply not putting in that groundwork. And if you do that groundwork, if you apply it in an appropriate manner, you'd be amazed what data protection will do for you. It will allow you to get on with your research projects with the confidence that you have managed a fundamental right and your patient's right to their data being protected. So some straight talking. Of course, GDPR is 21 weeks old. We're still all getting used to it. So it is like a newborn baby. For instance, I've just come back from a long meeting in Brussels where I'm the lead rapporteur on codes of conduct at a European level. And we are in a room with all our member states, and we are trying to come up with a guideline that everyone agrees to. But there is still some confusion in the room. So whilst yourselves in a health sector research environment have your problems, don't think that data protection authorities don't have similar problems also. This is new to us too. So always just remember that this new law is for us to, how do we apply it? How do we enforce it? How do we set up our structures that we are a competent supervisory authority who can carry out our role in an appropriate manner? But it does, like a 21-year-old baby, or 21-week-old baby, it's a life-changing experience. Helen Dixon used to say game-changing. So for me, extra responsibility, same. It's a little child. Extra responsibility, extra accountability. But it also brings in, if you put in the work, it brings so much reward. And that's what you need to be thinking about. Many people don't understand why we need it. Why the GDPR? Why now? Very simply, think about technology. Think about how far technology has come. Also think about the idea that the last data protection legal framework was 1995. It didn't even take on what the internet is today. The founders of the internet, the ones who created it, didn't assume the unintended consequences that we're all seeing today. There's a lack of regulation on online activity, and we're seeing that unintended consequence playing out live in terms of some of the issues that have arisen over the last few years. In a health sector context, you've also seen technology move on. A good one will be whole genome sequence. It went from probably one person, 2 billion US, to whole genome sequence, one person, to suddenly it's under the Christmas tree with a genealogy pack. So you have to consider, You have to regulate this. So the regulation itself is technology neutral, which effectively means it's a regulation that will stand the test of time. It'll be able to be applied to new technologies as they come forward. But it gives us a better chance as a regulator to regulate these new technology developments. Another area in which it's bringing about a change, and it's important, is that there was no enforcement. There's no point in having a regulation if there's no stick. We don't want to use the stick, but we need the stick. If there's no enforcement, people don't take it seriously. And there was a lack of enforcement provisions in the previous regulation, and that was a game changer in terms of what the GDPR did. It also looked at harmonization. You have big data companies who had to change up for every country they went into and processed data, because each country had their own parochial data protection laws. So GDPR is there to challenge, there to clear up and make it more simplified in terms of harmonization of the law. So the law in Ireland will mirror the law in the UK, France, and so on, so forth. And that's a very important concept, because when you look at that, and a lot of health research being conducted in Ireland is not just solely conducted in Ireland, you're looking at a European level and even further afield. And the GDPR provides a framework for harmonization. And even if you feel today that it doesn't have that, you don't feel it's there, harmonization, GDPR provides tools to allow for harmonization. And one of those tools, which we were working on yesterday, is codes of conduct. It allows. So again, if you put in the work, you'll get the benefit. Another thing, and it's misleading, data protection is not absolute. It has to be balanced against other rights and interests. Obviously, those rights should be the public interest. So not just the rights of a health sector researcher, they have to be seen in the main. And we are balancing all the time through context on what is the right thing to do. So when you read recital 4 of the GDPR, you will see that spelled out. It is for the benefit of mankind. It is a recognition it's not absolute. But what you do with a fundamental right is, oh, we can do whatever we want. No, you can't. You have to carry out that balance and test and figure out what is right in a certain situation. How far can we go in processing data to meet our ends whilst we interfere with the rights of an individual and their data and their personal data? So I would urge you all to read Recital 4 if you've never read it. And it's the first part of the GDPR. It's all those paragraphs that are to explain what the GDPR is about. And it'll give you a good indication that data protection is not there to get in the way. Data protection is just a matter, a fundamental right that needs to be considered as part of a bigger project. Substantively, and this is another message that people don't get, it hasn't really changed that much. We're talking about consent. It's still the same. It hasn't changed at all. Consent is now codified, you could argue, through the data protection or GDPR, but that's what the law was anyway. So it's something to remember. This is not something new. Consent has always been consent. The second thing is the principles. All those principles you hear about: fair, lawful, transparent, data minimization. Have a read of them. They're all the same. Again, no difference. And the big thing is, if you read the principles which are in Article 5 of GDPR, they're listed and they're actually very easy to understand what they mean. If you read them, if you are following those principles in your health research project, you're probably fine. But they're not new. They're the same as what the principles were back in 1995. So if you do have them in place, if you feel you're meeting those requirements, you're probably fine in your health research project. Consent, as we said, simply hasn't changed. Specific, informed, freely given, and unambiguous. The only difference, I suppose, with consent is you have to show it. That's accountability. But like, if a complaint came into Helen Dixon 3 months ago, before GDPR, 3 months, yeah, 4 months ago, we'll say, before GDPR came in, Helen Dixon and her team would be looking at, what does X data controller say about this? Show us your consent. So whilst GDPR has this accountability codified into the law, accountability was always there. If one person saying, I didn't give my consent, and the data controller saying, yes, they did, well, you're obviously going to go, show us. So it's not really that new either, just to indicate. So accountability always existed. It didn't exist as a specific provision within the GDPR, but it was there in reality behind the scenes. So in the round, GDPR data protection and research, in my view, they're not diametrically opposed at all. They can be reconciled very easily. They actually will help you out. If you take on the data protection elements and treat them with the respect that they should be treated with as any fundamental right, it'll pay dividends. It'll actually make your project better, because you're going back to patient-centered approach. You're involving the patient in everything. You're involving the individual in everything. So in my view, it doesn't hinder the advancement of health research. Rather, through its requirements for more transparency, accountability, it facilitates health researchers to carry out research in an ethical and responsible manner. And that respects the data privacy rights of all individuals. So one way you do it with ethics, and I always say it to lawyers and people like that, throw the law book out of the way a second. We all have data. People are processing data whilst they're in the room. Sure, I'm on a TV and being webcast somewhere and what have you. Everyone's data is being processed. When you have those phones, the amount of data on them is incredible. So when you're looking at health research, and I know your health research project is very important, there's a real objective, a real public interest to it, but you just have to stand back and say, would I be happy if my data was processed that way? Don't think about the law, think about what's right. And that's where your ethical skills, your ethical know-how comes in. And if you do what's right, if you take a stand back and be pragmatic about it, data protection isn't going to turn around and say, no, you're wrong. Because if you're ethically on the right track, you will, in the main, 99.9% of the time, be okay with data protection law. So always take a step back. Would I like my data being processed in that way? If I saw that consent form, would I be happy with this? So again, it's things to think about when you're on the ground working with data protection in your health research project. So like any fundamental right, a detailed evidence-based approach is required to justify the interference. So you can't just do it on the back of a beer mat. Think about it. How can we safeguard this? How can we approach our health research project in a very proportionate manner? Oh, I want all the data. No, you don't need all the data. You just need certain parts. That's all. So again, you're always trying to less is more. Minimize processing to achieve your objective. Don't ask for the world, just ask for the personal data you need. Then the consent form can fill in the bits about informing the patient. Plain English again. You may not have interaction with the patient, but at the end of the day, you have to take on board who you're dealing with. Who's your subject matter? And whilst people say, well, how do I do a consent form? I don't meet the subject matter. I don't meet them. You, on the ground, will have interaction with those individuals. So you should know, through that interaction, what type of consent form will work in terms of how the individual understands it. They had a great one a few years ago about children. I think it was one of the big data companies, and they had some kind of terms and conditions or privacy notice, and it was very legal speak and jargon. And what happened was they decided to focus group it, bring in children, and then what they did was they put it in children language, in a language that a child could learn. I think it was like a 12, 13-year-old cohort group. And when they all figured out what was happening, they all said no. When they read the legal, they couldn't care less. But when they actually started reading what was actually happening, they understood it, they all said no. So always when you're doing consent forms, bear that in mind. Who's your subject matter? It's very important because ultimately, if you get this right, it engenders trust. People in the main want health research to work. Everyone does. You know, obviously it's an ethical study. We want the study to achieve something at the end of it. I don't think there's anyone in this room or out there who doesn't want health research to work. But if you don't do things in the right way, if you drop the ball in terms of, say, a breach, where you didn't put in basic safeguards, you're going to lose trust. People will be less inclined to sign up for health research. So again, that's why data protection is important, because you have them in mind. You're empowering them, individuals on the street, to come to you. We want to sign up. So it is very important in terms of that engagement and trying to understand it's not all about the law, it's about your relationship with the organizations, the hospitals, with the patients, and so on and so forth. So why all the panic after all of that? Doesn't sound as scary now, does it? But the panic is enforcement. The 4 million. And I hear it every day. It's thrown at me. We used to have our office in Laois thrown at us. We weren't a proper organisation because what's wrong with Laois? We were a proper organisation. Now we have this. Oh, 4 million. Everything's 4 million or 4% of turnover. That's great for consultants to make money, because they use that for you to come and get worried and go, fix my problem. When a lot of the stuff you can do yourself, because you're the expert on the ground. You know what goes on the ground. You know how it's done. You know what can be improved. So there's an awful lot you can give to the process without getting scared. And that's another thing to remember. But without real enforcement, and this is why we've been going to these kind of conferences quite a bit, and this is why the room is full. If I was here 3 years ago, and there was no GDPR, I'd be lucky if even one section was full. Now the whole place, everyone that's sold out and so on and so forth. But it is very important. That's what I'm trying to get across. It is very important. And we will enforce, don't get me wrong. We weren't given these powers not to use. We will use them, but we'll use them in a very dissuasive manner. It's to send a message. We're not going after people for the sake of going after people. We're out to ensure that the fundamental right is respected and treated accordingly. And that may require complaints and fines. It may require some sort of desist from processing activities, so on and so forth. But the sanction will always be proportionate to the problem. And that's something to remember. We will not go out of our way to suddenly kill an organisation. To be quite frank, in a lot of these areas, it'll be about reputational damage, which will be bigger than any fine that you could attach to a contravention of the law. But it's real. Now it's real, and we as the Commission, as I've said, we're deadly serious. And to put it into terms, we had our budget recently there, and we would have done very well out of it. So we're being promised it's 15.3 million for next year. To put that in context, Helen Dixon, when she started as the Commissioner, the budget in 2014 was 1.9 million. For 2019, it is 15.3. We are going, when I joined, I think we had, was it just under 30 or was I just over 30? But it was around 30. We now have 105, I think, on site with 120 by the end of the year. We would expect another 40 to 60 employees to get us probably up to about 180 for 2019. Putting that in context, I think we'll be the third biggest DPA in Europe. So we're a heavy hitter, and all eyes are focused on us. We obviously have very big data companies in this country, and a lot of eyes are focused on us in terms of how we manage the GDPR. But with that money, we're not going to sit around. We're going to use it. We're going to use it to our advantage in terms of enforcement, but also in terms of engagement. I and Helen don't want to be going around with a stick. What we want to do is make sure ye and other data controllers get it right. Because if you all get it right, we don't need the stick. And that's what we're trying to do. Through guidance we'll be developing and so on and so forth. Through engagement with data controllers, through helping policy decisions be made, helping other guidance from sectors, and allowing them the confidence to get on with what they want to do, which is health research in your case. So we are going to be serious. We will also have powers in terms of own volition. So we may actually identify a systemic issue where it may require us to go in and to look at it, not wait for a complaint, but to go in and to see what the problems are or in order to advise the rest of the sector. So we could easily look at the health sector research area and see, well, how's it working? Let's pick organisations and see what's going on under the hood, and make recommendations. So it could be like an audit type function, but we will use those powers too, more to help the sector out get it right. It is still very new. There's still lead-in time. There's still things not being done right. It's not a light switch. These things take time, but we'll all get there. Some people describe the data protection area like health and safety. It took a while for the culture to change, but we will get there, and our resources will help in that fight. So just to sum up, it's time to seize the opportunity of driving a deeper culture of respect in the health research community for the fundamental right to data protection. I think in general, the health research community wants to get this right, always wants to get it right, because consent and things of that nature have always been there, confidentiality. So you're well capable of doing it, but you also want to do it. You know, most data controllers, most people in this area want to get it right. They just need a bit of help in how to get there. But if you acknowledge data protection compliance is not, and this is it, if you take this step that it's not a barrier to what you want to do, and if you look at data protection and embrace it, you will be successful in getting your health research project over the line through ethics committees and so forth. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the talk later. Thank you.